The night is very still. A soft wind moves slowly across the wide desert, carrying fine grains of sand over the smooth surface of the earth. The sky above is deep and dark, filled with small, quiet stars that seem to watch from a great distance. Nothing rushes here. Nothing feels hurried. In this place, time moves differently. Long before the modern world, long before cities filled with light and sound, there was a land shaped by a gentle river. The river moved calmly through the desert, bringing life to the people who lived along its banks. This was ancient Egypt, a place of warmth, rhythm, and quiet devotion. Each morning began the same way. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, spreading soft gold light across the water. Farmers walked toward their fields, carrying simple tools made of wood and stone. The air was cool at first, but it would not stay that way for long. Soon, the heat would settle in, wrapping everything in a steady, heavy warmth. Life here followed patterns that rarely changed. People woke, worked, rested, and slept in a gentle cycle. They ground grain into flour. They baked bread in small clay ovens. They carried water in jars balanced carefully on their shoulders. Children played near the edges of the river, their laughter soft and distant. And always, there was a quiet awareness of something more. The people of ancient Egypt believed that life did not end with death. Instead, it continued in another place, a place just beyond the world they could see. Because of this, death was not feared in the same way. It was prepared for, slowly and carefully, over many years. This belief shaped everything. It shaped how they built their homes. It shaped how they spoke their prayers. And most of all, it shaped how they treated the dead. When a person died, their body was not simply buried. It was preserved with great care, wrapped in linen, and placed inside a tomb. These tombs were not empty spaces. They were filled with objects, food, tools, clothing, and small personal items, things the person might need in the next life. The tomb was not an ending. It was a beginning. But with this deep respect for the dead came another idea, one that moved quietly beneath the surface of daily life. It was the idea of protection. Because if life continued after death, then the dead must remain undisturbed. Their resting place had to be safe. Their journey had to remain uninterrupted. Any harm to the tomb could disturb the balance between worlds. And so, slowly, over time, a different kind of belief took shape. A belief in curses. These curses were not loud or dramatic. They were not spoken in anger or fear. Instead, they were written softly, carved into stone, or hidden within the quiet walls of a tomb. They were warnings, gentle but firm. They said, in simple words, that those who disturbed the resting place of the dead would face consequences. The people who created these tombs believed deeply in order. They believed that the world had a natural balance, and that this balance must not be broken. To disturb a tomb was to disrupt that balance. And so the curses were placed, not as threats, but as guardians. As the sun moved across the sky, the desert would grow silent again. Workers would return home, their steps slow and steady. The evening would bring cooler air, and the land would rest. But beneath the surface of the sand, something remained. Tombs, hidden and sealed. Inside them, bodies wrapped carefully in linen. Objects placed with intention. Walls covered in symbols and quiet words. And sometimes, among those words, a message. A simple sentence, carved into stone. A warning to anyone who might enter. It might say that the one who breaks the seal will lose their peace. It might say that illness will follow them. It might speak of unseen forces that move quietly in the dark. These words were not meant to frighten. They were meant to protect. To the people of ancient Egypt, the world was filled with unseen presence. The wind, the river, the shifting sand, everything carried meaning. Everything was part of a larger order. Even silence had a role. And so, when a tomb was sealed, it was done with care. The entrance was closed. The sand slowly covered it. Time passed. Years became decades. Decades became centuries. The world above changed. New rulers came and went. Villages grew and faded. The river continued its steady path, just as it always had. But below the surface, the tombs remained. Still. Quiet. Undisturbed. The air inside them did not move. The darkness did not shift. Everything stayed exactly as it had been left. And the words carved into the walls remained as well. Waiting. Not with urgency, but with patience. Because in a place where time moves slowly, there is no need to hurry. The idea of a curse, in this world, was not a sudden thing. It was not a burst of anger or a moment of fear. It was something quiet, something steady, something that existed alongside daily life. It was part of the same calm rhythm as the river, the sun, and the passing of time. As night falls again over the desert, the stars return to their places in the sky. The wind softens, moving gently across the sand. Somewhere beneath that sand, a sealed doorway rests in silence. Behind it, a chamber untouched for countless years. And on the wall, in faint carved lines, a message still remains. Not loud. Not urgent. Just present. And waiting. The desert does not forget. Even as the wind moves softly across the land, even as the surface shifts and changes, there are things that remain hidden beneath it. Things that were placed there with care, with intention, and with a quiet hope that they would never be disturbed. Beneath the sand, the tombs rest as they always have. Inside them, the air is still. It has not moved for a very long time. The walls hold their color, though it has softened with age. Faded reds, gentle blues, warm gold tones that once felt bright now rest in a quieter state. The images painted there tell slow and careful stories. A man seated at a table. A woman holding a small flower. Servants carrying baskets of grain. Everything is arranged with calm purpose. Nothing is rushed. And among these images, there are also words. They are carved into the stone with steady hands. Each line is placed with care, each symbol shaped slowly, as if the person creating it understood that these words would last far beyond their own life. These were not ordinary messages. They were not meant for the living. They were meant for anyone who might come later. For someone who might stand in that silent room, long after the people who built it were gone. The words often spoke in a quiet voice. They did not shout. They did not demand attention. Instead, they offered a gentle warning. They might say that the tomb is protected. That the one who rests inside is under the care of unseen forces. That those who enter with respect will find peace, but those who do not may carry something with them when they leave. Something unseen. Something that cannot be easily understood. To the people who wrote these words, this was not a story. It was simply part of the world. They believed that every person had more than just a body. There was also a spirit, something that continued on after death. This spirit needed a place to return to, a place to rest, a place to recognize. That place was the tomb. If the tomb was disturbed, then the spirit might lose its way. And if the spirit was disturbed, then the balance between the worlds could shift. This idea was not spoken with fear. It was spoken with quiet certainty. And so the words were placed, not as threats, but as reminders. Over time, some of these tombs became known, not by the people who built them, but by those who came much later. Travelers, explorers, and workers began to uncover these hidden places. Slowly, carefully, they brushed away the sand, revealing doorways that had not been seen for generations. At first, there was only curiosity. A sealed entrance. A narrow passage. A cool breath of air escaping from within. Then, as they stepped inside, they would see the walls. The colors. The shapes. The stillness. And sometimes, the words. Simple lines, carved into the stone. Words that had been waiting. Some of these messages were easy to understand. They spoke of protection. Of peace. Of the importance of leaving things as they were found. Others were more difficult. They spoke in ways that felt distant, as if they belonged to a time that no longer existed. Their meaning was not always clear, but their presence was. And that presence carried a feeling. Not a loud feeling. Not something sharp or sudden. But something quiet. A sense that the space was not empty. That it was still connected to something beyond the visible world. Among the many tombs that rested beneath the desert, a few became known for the strength of their warnings. These were not grand declarations. They were simple, but firm. One such message, carved into a stone surface near the entrance of a burial chamber, spoke of those who might disturb the resting place. It said that the one who entered without respect would find their life shortened. That their days would become uncertain. That their peace would be taken from them. The words were not long. They did not need to be. They were clear enough. Another inscription spoke more softly. It did not mention harm directly. Instead, it spoke of balance. It said that the tomb was a place of rest, and that rest should not be broken. It reminded the reader that the world worked best when things remained in their proper place. There was no anger in these words. Only a quiet firmness. Over time, stories began to gather around these inscriptions. People spoke of those who had entered tombs and later experienced strange misfortune. Illness that came without warning. Accidents that seemed unusual. A feeling of unease that did not easily fade. These stories moved slowly from person to person. They were not told loudly. They were shared in quiet voices, often in the evening, when the day had ended and the world felt still. Some believed these stories completely. Others listened, but remained uncertain. Yet even those who did not fully believe would sometimes pause when standing at the entrance of a tomb. They would notice the silence. The still air. The sense that this place had been left untouched for a very long time. And they would feel something. Not fear. But awareness. A recognition that they were stepping into a space that was not meant for them. In the deeper parts of these tombs, the chambers would open slightly, revealing the resting place itself. A stone coffin, carefully shaped. A lid, heavy and unmoving. Around it, objects placed with care. Small statues. Bowls. Tools. Pieces of cloth. Each item chosen with intention. Each item part of a quiet preparation for a journey beyond. And on the walls nearby, more words. Sometimes they spoke directly to the spirit of the one who rested there. They offered guidance. They described the path ahead. They reminded the spirit of its name, so that it would not forget who it was. Because to forget one's name was to become lost. And to become lost was to drift without rest. So the tomb was filled not only with objects, but with memory, with identity, with care. The curses, if they can be called that, were only a small part of this larger picture. They were not the focus. They were simply a layer. A quiet protection placed over something deeply important. As the years continued to pass, more tombs were uncovered. More inscriptions were found. Some were damaged. Some were incomplete. But many still held their meaning. And always, the tone remained the same. Calm. Steady. Unchanging. The desert above continued its slow movement. The river flowed as it always had. The people of later times came and went, each bringing their own thoughts, their own beliefs, their own questions. But the tombs remained as they were. Still. Quiet. Patient. And within them, the words remained as well. Not fading. Not disappearing. Simply waiting, as they had always done. Waiting for eyes to see them again. Waiting for footsteps to return. Waiting, without urgency, in the same gentle stillness that has always belonged to the land. And as the night deepens once more, the desert grows calm again. The wind slows. The stars remain. And beneath the surface, the silent chambers rest, holding their stories, their warnings, and their quiet sense of balance, just as they have for countless years. Morning comes slowly to the desert. The first light spreads gently across the horizon, touching the tops of distant dunes before settling over the wide and quiet land. The air is cool for a brief moment, holding a softness that will soon fade as the sun rises higher. In this early stillness, there is a feeling of calm. A feeling that nothing has changed. And yet, over time, something has. The long silence of the tombs has not remained untouched forever. There came a period when the hidden places beneath the sand began to open again. Not all at once, and not with great noise, but slowly, in careful steps. The surface of the desert shifted, and the shapes beneath it began to reveal themselves. At first, it was only small signs. A stone edge where there should have been only sand. A faint outline of a wall. A difference in the way the ground felt beneath a person's feet. These signs were quiet, easy to miss. But they were noticed. People began to look more closely at the land. They brushed away layers of sand with patient hands. They worked in silence, moving carefully, as if they understood that they were approaching something that had been left undisturbed for a very long time. And then, slowly, an entrance would appear. A doorway cut into stone. Sealed. Still. Often covered by years of sand and time. The moment of opening such a place was never rushed. There was a pause. A stillness. The workers would stand quietly, looking at the sealed surface before them. They could feel the weight of time in that single space. The understanding that no one had crossed that threshold for generations, perhaps for longer than memory could easily hold. When the seal was finally broken, it was done with care. Stone moved slowly. Dust lifted gently into the air. And from within, a breath of cool stillness would emerge. It was not a strong wind. Just a soft release, as if the space inside had been waiting. Inside, the darkness was complete. Light did not reach far at first. It touched only the entrance, revealing a narrow passage that led deeper into the earth. The air inside felt different. Not heavy, but still. Untouched. Each step forward was quiet. Footsteps echoed softly against the stone, fading quickly into silence. The walls, when the light reached them, began to show their colors. Faint images, carefully drawn. Lines that told stories in a language shaped long ago. And among these images, as before, there were words. The same calm carvings. The same quiet messages. Now seen again after a long time. Some who entered these tombs would stop when they saw them. They would read slowly, tracing the shapes with their eyes. Even when the meaning was not fully understood, there was something in the arrangement of the symbols that suggested intention. A purpose that had not faded. These were not decorations. They were messages placed with care. In one passage, near the entrance to a deeper chamber, a line of text rested just above eye level. It spoke of the one who lay within, describing them as someone protected, someone watched over by forces that did not sleep. It did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a statement. A simple truth, as it was understood by those who created it. Further inside, the path would sometimes narrow, guiding the visitor into a chamber where the walls closed in slightly, holding the space in quiet balance. The ceiling above felt low, not oppressive, but close enough to remind a person that they were deep beneath the surface. And then, the chamber would open. A wider space, still and undisturbed. At its center, the resting place. A stone coffin, shaped with care, its surface smooth but aged. Around it, the objects that had been placed long ago remained where they had been left. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. The stillness here was deeper than anywhere else. It held a quiet presence. And again, on the walls, the words. Some of them were more direct. They spoke not only of protection, but of consequence. One inscription, placed near the resting place itself, described what might happen to someone who disturbed the peace of the tomb. It spoke of a life that would lose its balance, of days that would no longer follow their natural rhythm. It did not describe how. It did not need to. The message was enough. Another line, carved more faintly, seemed almost gentle. It asked the reader to remember that the tomb was not empty. That it was a place of rest, and that rest should be honored. There was no anger. Only a quiet request. As more tombs were opened, these patterns became familiar. The same careful preparation. The same calm arrangement. The same presence of words that spoke softly, but clearly. And with each opening, the feeling remained the same. A sense that the space had been waiting. Not in expectation, but in stillness. Stories began to form again, just as they had before. They were not written in official records at first. They were spoken quietly, shared between those who had entered these places and those who listened with calm attention. Some spoke of a strange unease that followed them after leaving a tomb. Not fear, but a lingering stillness that did not fully fade. Others spoke of small changes in their lives. Moments that felt slightly out of place. Events that did not follow their expected path. These stories were never loud. They were not told with urgency. They moved slowly, like the wind across the desert, carrying with them a sense of quiet mystery. At the same time, there were those who saw these events differently. They viewed the tombs as places of history, as records of a time long past. They focused on the objects, the art, the careful design of each space. They studied the walls, the symbols, the arrangement of the chambers. They worked to understand. And in their work, they brought light into spaces that had long remained dark. Even so, the words on the walls did not change. They remained as they had always been. Calm. Steady. Present. The desert above continued its slow rhythm. Days passed into nights. The sun rose and fell. The wind moved across the land, shaping the surface in quiet patterns. Below, the tombs were no longer completely hidden. Some had been opened. Some remained sealed. And in each one, the same quiet elements remained. The still air. The careful arrangement. The presence of words that spoke across time. As evening returns, the light fades once more. The desert cools again. Shadows stretch across the sand, soft and long. And beneath it all, the chambers rest in their quiet state, holding their stories, their warnings, and their calm sense of balance. Nothing rushes. Nothing changes quickly. Everything remains as it has been. Still. Silent. And waiting. As the desert continues its slow and steady rhythm, there are certain places beneath the sand that seem to hold a deeper stillness than others. These places were not always the largest. They were not always the most elaborate. And yet, over time, they became the most remembered. One such place rested in a narrow valley, surrounded by pale stone cliffs that rose gently under the sun. The ground there was dry and quiet, shaped by years of wind and light. During the day, the heat settled softly into the earth. At night, the air cooled, and silence returned. For a long time, this valley held many hidden chambers. Some had been found. Others remained covered. And among them was a tomb that had not been opened for countless years. Its entrance was small, almost unnoticeable at first. It lay beneath layers of sand and stone, its presence hidden by time. Nothing marked it clearly. Nothing called attention to it. It simply rested. Then, slowly, it was revealed. The sand was moved carefully, grain by grain. The outline of steps appeared, leading downward into the earth. The air around the entrance felt slightly different, as if something long sealed was beginning to breathe again. There was no rush. The work continued with patience. When the doorway was uncovered, it was found to be sealed. The surface showed signs of careful closure, as though those who had placed it there intended for it to remain untouched. For a moment, everything paused. The people standing there could feel the quiet weight of time pressing gently around them. This was not just a space. It was a moment held still for generations. When the seal was finally opened, the first glimpse inside revealed something unexpected. The chamber beyond was not empty. Objects rested there, undisturbed. Chests, carefully arranged. Small items placed with intention. The space did not feel broken or scattered. It felt complete. As the light moved further inside, more details began to appear. Walls covered in soft color. Symbols arranged in calm patterns. A sense of order that had not been disturbed. This was unusual. Many tombs, once opened in the past, had already been changed in some way. Objects moved. Spaces altered. Time had touched them. But here, time had been held back. The deeper chambers revealed even more. A burial space, still sealed within the tomb itself. Layer upon layer of protection. And inside, the resting place of a young king. His name had been known before, but only faintly, like a distant memory. Now, it returned more clearly, carried through the quiet discovery of this untouched place. The objects within the tomb spoke softly of his life. Simple things, and also things of great care. A chair, shaped with smooth lines. Small statues, placed gently. Jewelry that caught the light in a quiet, steady way. Each item held a purpose. Each one part of a larger preparation. And among all of this, as always, there were words. They were not many, but they were present. On certain surfaces, carved or painted with steady hands, were lines that spoke of protection. Not in a loud voice, but in the same calm tone that had been used for generations. One message, placed near the inner chamber, described the king as one who rested under watchful care. It suggested that those who disturbed this rest would lose their own sense of peace. It did not explain how. It simply stated the idea. Another inscription, more subtle, seemed to speak directly to the space itself. It described the tomb as a place of balance, a place where the order of the world continued even in stillness. These words were not meant to be seen often. They were not placed for frequent reading. They were there as part of the space, as part of its quiet protection. As news of this tomb spread, people began to speak of it in low, careful voices. They spoke of how it had remained untouched, how everything inside had stayed as it was, and how, in the time that followed its opening, certain events began to take shape. These events were not always clear. They were not always easy to connect. But they were noticed. A person who had been present during the opening later became unwell. Another experienced a sudden change in their life, something unexpected and difficult to explain. These moments, taken alone, might have seemed ordinary. But together, they formed a pattern that some could not ignore. The stories began to move quietly, just as they had before. From one voice to another. From one place to the next. They spoke of a curse. Not a loud or dramatic one. But something softer. Something that followed, rather than struck. Something that moved slowly, like the passing of time itself. There were those who listened and believed. They felt that the words carved into the tomb had meaning beyond their simple form. That they were not just messages, but active parts of the world, still carrying the intention placed within them. And there were those who listened with calm skepticism. They saw the events as separate, as part of the natural flow of life. They believed that the connection between the tomb and these moments was something created by the human mind, a way of finding patterns in quiet and uncertain things. Both views existed side by side. Neither disturbed the other. And the tomb itself remained unchanged. Inside, the air stayed still. The objects remained where they had been placed. The walls continued to hold their soft colors and careful lines. And the words remained. Calm. Unmoving. Present. As the years passed, the tomb became known not only for its beauty, but for its quiet mystery. It was not the largest. It was not the most elaborate. But it held something that others did not. A sense of completeness. A feeling that nothing had been lost. And within that completeness, the idea of a curse found a place. Not as something separate, but as something woven gently into the larger story. As night falls once more over the valley, the cliffs grow soft in the fading light. The air cools, and the silence returns. The entrance to the tomb remains open now, no longer hidden by sand. But inside, the deeper chambers still hold their quiet. Still hold their stillness. Still hold the presence of words that were never meant to fade. And somewhere within those walls, the same gentle message remains. Not loud. Not urgent. Just steady. Just present. And always, waiting. The desert returns to its quiet rhythm, as it always does. Morning light comes and goes. The sun rises gently, crosses the wide sky, and lowers itself again into the horizon. Nothing feels rushed. Nothing demands attention. The land continues as it has for a very long time. And yet, within this calm, the story continues to unfold. The tomb of the young king remains open now, its entrance no longer hidden beneath sand. People come and go in careful steps. They speak in low voices, as though the quiet of the place asks for it. Inside, the air still carries that same stillness. It does not feel empty. It feels preserved. Each object remains where it was placed. Each surface holds the marks of careful hands. The painted walls continue to show their softened colors, telling stories that do not fade, only settle deeper into silence. Time moves differently here. Outside, days pass quickly. Seasons shift, even if only slightly. The wind reshapes the surface of the desert again and again. But inside the tomb, nothing changes. And this contrast begins to settle into the thoughts of those who enter. They begin to notice it. The difference between the moving world and the still one. Some feel a quiet sense of wonder. Others feel something harder to describe. Not fear, but a kind of weight. A sense that they are standing in a place where time has paused, and that their own movement feels out of place within it. The stories continue to grow, slowly and softly. They are never told with urgency. They do not demand belief. They simply exist. One story speaks of a man who spent many hours inside the tomb, studying the objects, observing the walls, moving carefully through the chambers. He worked with patience and respect, but after some time, those around him noticed a change. He became quieter, more distant. He spoke less, as if his thoughts had settled somewhere deeper than before. There was no sudden moment. No clear cause. Only a gradual shift. Another story tells of a worker who had helped clear the entrance. His role was simple. He moved sand, lifted small stones, and followed instructions given by others. For a time, everything was as expected. But later, something in his life began to change. Small things at first. A sense of unease. Moments of stillness that felt different from the calm of the desert. He could not explain it. And he did not try to. He simply carried on, as people do. These stories, like the others, moved quietly from person to person. They were not written in bold lines. They were not declared as truth. They were shared gently, often with a pause between sentences, as though the speaker was choosing each word carefully. At the same time, the work within the tomb continued. Objects were studied. Images were observed. The structure of the chambers was carefully noted. Each detail added to a growing understanding of the people who had built this place so long ago. The care, the patience, the intention, it all became clearer. And with that clarity came a deeper respect. Even those who did not believe in curses could feel it. The sense that this was not simply a collection of objects. It was a space filled with meaning. A space that had been created with thought and purpose. The words on the walls remained as they always had. They did not change. They did not fade away. They continued to exist in their quiet way, offering the same gentle warnings, the same calm reminders. One line, nearly hidden in a corner of a chamber, spoke again of balance. It described the world as something that moves in harmony, where each part has its place. To disturb that harmony, it suggested, was to invite something uncertain. Not something loud, but something that would slowly unfold. This idea settled into the minds of those who read it. Not as fear, but as something to consider. Outside, the world continued. People lived their lives. They worked, rested, spoke, and moved through their days as they always had. But for those who had entered the tomb, something remained with them. A memory of stillness. A feeling that did not fully leave. It was not always uncomfortable. Sometimes, it was simply quiet. A deeper quiet than before. As the years passed, the tomb became a place of both study and reflection. Some came to learn. Some came to observe. And some came simply to stand within its chambers, to experience the stillness for themselves. Each person carried away something slightly different. But the core of the experience remained the same. A sense of stepping into a space where time had slowed. Where the past had not fully faded. Where the presence of those who had built it could still be felt, not as something visible, but as something quietly present. The idea of the curse continued to exist alongside all of this. Not separate. Not dominant. Just present. Like a shadow that moves gently with the light, never fully leaving, never fully taking shape. As evening returns once more, the desert settles into its familiar calm. The sky darkens slowly. The stars begin to appear, one by one. The air cools, and the wind softens. The entrance to the tomb remains open, but inside, the deeper chambers return to their quiet state. The footsteps fade. The voices disappear. And once again, the stillness takes its place. The walls remain. The objects remain. The words remain. Calm. Steady. Unchanging. And as time continues its slow movement, the story does not end. It simply continues, as it always has, carried gently by the desert, by the silence, and by the quiet presence of things that have never truly been disturbed. The night settles gently over the desert once more. The warmth of the day fades into a soft coolness, and the wide sky fills with quiet stars. There is no sudden change, no sharp moment when day becomes night. It happens slowly, almost unnoticed, like a long breath released into still air. In this calm, the land feels endless. And beneath it, the chambers remain. Still. Silent. Holding their quiet presence as they always have. Above the surface, however, the story continues to move. Not in the form of loud announcements or grand declarations, but in small, careful voices. The stories of the tomb, of the words carved into its walls, and of the events that followed its opening begin to travel beyond the valley. They move slowly, carried by those who have seen the place with their own eyes, and by those who have only heard of it. Each telling is slightly different. Not in meaning, but in tone. Some speak with quiet certainty, as though the connection between the tomb and the events that followed is clear and undeniable. Others speak with a softer uncertainty, leaving space between their words, allowing the listener to decide what they feel. And some simply describe what was found, what was seen, and what was experienced, without placing any meaning beyond that. All of these voices exist together. None of them overpower the others. They move gently through conversations, through quiet gatherings, through moments of still reflection. The idea of the curse begins to take on a shape. Not a fixed shape, but something that shifts slightly depending on who speaks of it. For some, it is something active. A force placed within the tomb, waiting patiently, responding to disturbance. For others, it is something more subtle. A reflection of imbalance. A quiet consequence of stepping into a place that was meant to remain undisturbed. And for others still, it is simply a story. A way of understanding the unknown. A way of giving form to events that do not easily explain themselves. As these ideas spread, they do not lose their calm. They do not become loud or urgent. They remain slow. Measured. Thoughtful. The desert itself seems unchanged by all of this. The wind continues to move across the surface. The sand shifts in soft patterns. The cliffs stand in their quiet strength, touched by light during the day and shadow during the night. And beneath it all, the tomb remains as it was. The still air. The careful arrangement. The presence of words that continue to exist without change. Those who return to the tomb after some time often notice something familiar. The same feeling of quiet. The same sense that the space is separate from the world outside. Time still feels different there. Not stopped, but slowed. As though each moment is allowed to rest before moving on. Some visitors find comfort in this. They stand quietly within the chambers, letting the stillness settle around them. They observe the walls, the objects, the gentle patterns of light and shadow. They do not rush. Others feel a quiet tension. Not fear, but a sense that they are part of something they do not fully understand. They move carefully. They speak softly. They remain aware of where they are. Both experiences are valid. Both are part of the same space. The words on the walls continue to offer their gentle presence. They do not change their meaning. They do not become clearer or more obscure. They remain exactly as they were when they were first placed there. One inscription, placed near a narrow passage, speaks again of protection. It describes unseen guardians, not as figures of fear, but as watchers, calm and steady, maintaining the balance of the space. Another line, nearly hidden in shadow, speaks of remembrance. It suggests that the one who rests within the tomb continues to exist in a different form, connected to the place, aware in a way that is not easily understood. These ideas are not forced upon the reader. They are simply present. Quiet. Steady. Available to be noticed. As the stories continue to spread, they begin to reach those who have never seen the desert. Those who have never stood before a sealed doorway. Those who have never felt the still air of a chamber untouched for generations. And yet, even at a distance, the stories carry something with them. A sense of quiet mystery. A feeling that there are places in the world where time moves differently. Where the past remains close to the present. Where words carved long ago still hold their place. Some who hear these stories imagine the tomb clearly. They picture the narrow entrance. The descending steps. The dim light touching the walls. They imagine the silence. The stillness. The presence of something that cannot be easily named. Others simply listen and let the story pass gently through their thoughts, like a soft breeze that does not linger. There is no need to decide. No need to choose what is true or not. The story exists either way. As time continues its slow and steady movement, the tomb remains. It does not respond to the stories. It does not change because of them. It simply continues to exist in its quiet state. The desert above continues its rhythm. Day and night. Light and shadow. Warmth and coolness. All moving in a steady, unbroken flow. And beneath it, the chambers hold their stillness. The objects remain in place. The walls continue to tell their quiet stories. The words remain as they have always been. Calm. Present. Unmoving. And as the night deepens once more, the stories settle as well. They do not disappear. They simply rest. Waiting, like everything else in the desert, in that same gentle stillness that has always been there. The desert stretches wide and pale beneath the morning sky. Light moves slowly across the land, touching the ridges of stone and the gentle curves of sand. The air is cool for a short while, holding a soft stillness before the warmth of the day begins to rise. In one part of this quiet land, there is a valley. It rests between tall, dry cliffs that seem to fold inward, creating a space that feels both open and enclosed at the same time. The ground there is firm, marked by paths that have formed over long periods of time. This place came to be known as the resting ground of many rulers. A place where kings were brought after their lives had ended. A place chosen not for its beauty, but for its stillness. The valley holds a silence that feels deeper than the surrounding land. It is not empty. It is simply quiet. Beneath its surface, many chambers were carved into the stone, each one created with patience and care. These were not simple spaces. They were carefully planned, shaped to guide the journey of the one who would rest within. Each tomb followed a path. A long corridor leading downward. Walls that narrowed and opened again. Chambers placed in quiet sequence, each one holding its own purpose. And throughout these spaces, there were words. Always the words. Carved into stone. Painted with care. Placed where they would remain, unseen by most, yet always present. These words spoke of protection. Of balance. Of the continuation of life beyond what could be seen. But in some tombs, there were also warnings. Not loud. Not harsh. But clear. One such tomb, resting deeper within the valley, held a passage where the walls were covered in lines of text that seemed to flow like a calm stream. The symbols moved in gentle patterns, guiding the eye along their path. Within those lines, there was a message. It spoke of the one who lay within as being under the care of unseen forces. It described the tomb as a place that should remain undisturbed, not because of fear, but because of order. To disturb that order, it suggested, would bring a quiet change. A change that would not come all at once. But slowly. Like the shifting of sand. Like the fading of light at the end of the day. Another tomb held a different kind of message. Near the entrance, just above the doorway, a simple line had been carved. It did not describe the person within. It did not speak of protection in detail. It simply stated that those who entered without respect would lose something they could not easily name. The words were short. But they remained. Visitors who came to this valley often moved with care. Even those who did not believe in curses felt the weight of the place. Not as something heavy or pressing, but as something steady. A presence that asked for quiet. The cliffs above seemed to hold the sound of footsteps, softening them, returning them gently to silence. The air itself felt still, as though it carried the memory of every movement that had taken place there over time. Some who walked through the valley described a feeling of being watched. Not in a way that caused fear, but in a way that created awareness. As though the place itself was observing, quietly, without judgment. Others felt only calm. A deep, steady calm that settled into their thoughts and slowed them. They walked slowly. They spoke softly. They listened to the quiet around them. Inside the tombs, the same stillness remained. The walls held their colors. The symbols continued to rest in their careful arrangement. The air did not move. It simply existed. And always, there were the words. In one chamber, far from the entrance, a line of text rested near the ceiling, where it would not be easily seen. It spoke of time, not as something that passes, but as something that surrounds. It suggested that those who enter the tomb step into a different part of time. A place where past and present meet in quiet balance. And within that balance, it hinted, actions have meaning that may not be immediately understood. These ideas did not demand belief. They did not ask for attention. They were simply there. Part of the space. Part of the silence. As the years passed, the valley became known not only for the rulers who rested beneath it, but for the quiet sense of mystery that surrounded it. The idea of curses did not dominate the place. It moved gently alongside everything else. A part of the story. A part of the atmosphere. Those who studied the valley often focused on the details. The structure of the tombs. The patterns of the artwork. The materials used in the construction. They sought understanding through observation. Through patience. Through careful thought. And in doing so, they revealed much about the lives of those who had lived long ago. But even with this understanding, the quiet presence of the words remained. They were not explained away. They were not dismissed. They continued to exist as they always had. Calm. Steady. Unchanged. As evening returns to the valley, the light softens against the cliffs. Shadows stretch gently across the ground. The air cools, and the silence deepens once more. The entrances to the tombs grow darker. The pathways become less visible. And beneath the surface, the chambers return fully to their stillness. Nothing moves. Nothing shifts. The walls remain. The objects remain. The words remain. And in that quiet, the same gentle feeling lingers. Not fear. Not certainty. Just a presence. Soft. Unspoken. And always there. The morning arrives slowly once again. Light spreads gently across the desert, touching the edges of stone and sand with a quiet warmth. The air is still, holding that familiar calm that seems to exist in this place at all times. Nothing feels hurried. Nothing feels loud. And within this stillness, the story continues, moving deeper into the meaning of the words left behind. Because the curses of ancient Egypt were not always meant to frighten. They were, in many ways, a language. A quiet way of protecting what had been carefully placed. A way of keeping balance in a world that was understood as deeply connected, where every action carried a response, even if that response was slow and unseen. Those who created the tombs did not see them as empty spaces. They saw them as homes. Not homes for the living, but for those who had moved into another form of existence. Every object placed inside had a purpose. Every wall had meaning. And every word was chosen with care. The language used in these spaces was calm and deliberate. It did not rely on force. It did not shout. Instead, it suggested. It described. It reminded. In one tomb, a line of text described the resting place as being under the care of gentle guardians. These guardians were not named in a way that created fear. They were not described as violent or harsh. They were simply present. Watching. Maintaining. Ensuring that the order of the space remained undisturbed. Another inscription spoke of the heart. Not the physical heart, but the idea of it as the center of a person's being. It suggested that those who entered the tomb with a clear and respectful mind would leave unchanged, but those who carried imbalance within themselves might feel that imbalance grow. This was not a threat. It was a reflection. A quiet observation about the connection between the person and the place. These ideas were repeated in different forms across many tombs. Not exactly the same, but similar in tone. Always calm. Always measured. The concept of a curse, then, begins to shift. It is no longer something that strikes suddenly. It is not something that appears out of nowhere. Instead, it becomes something that unfolds. Something that moves slowly, in harmony with the rest of the world. Like the desert wind. like the passing of time, like the steady movement of light across stone. Those who study these inscriptions often notice the patterns, the way certain ideas return again and again. Balance, protection, order, respect. These words form a quiet structure, a way of understanding the purpose behind the tombs and the messages within them. And within that structure, the idea of a curse becomes something softer. Not less powerful, but less immediate. It is something that exists as part of the world, not separate from it. Some who enter these spaces feel this deeply. They do not describe it as fear. They describe it as awareness. A sense that their presence matters. That their actions have weight, even in silence. They move carefully. They observe quietly. They allow the space to remain as it is. Others feel only curiosity. They see the inscriptions as part of history, as expressions of belief that belong to another time. They read the words, consider their meaning, and continue on. Both experiences are part of the same place. Neither one changes the space itself. The tombs remain as they always have. Still. Silent. Holding their quiet presence. The walls continue to carry their messages. The symbols remain clear, shaped with care by hands that lived long ago. And the air within the chambers remains unchanged. It does not move. It does not shift. It simply exists. As the day moves forward, the warmth grows. The desert brightens under the sun. Outside, the world continues in its steady rhythm. But inside the tombs, that rhythm slows. The difference becomes more noticeable. Time feels stretched. Moments feel longer. Silence feels deeper. And within that silence, the words remain. They do not ask to be understood all at once. They do not demand attention. They simply exist, waiting quietly for those who notice them. One final inscription, found deep within a narrow chamber, speaks in the simplest way of all. It says that the resting place is complete. That it has been prepared with care. And that it should remain as it is. Nothing more. Nothing less. These words do not carry fear. They carry intention. A quiet request. A gentle reminder. And perhaps, within that simplicity, the true nature of the curse can be felt. Not as something separate, but as something woven into the fabric of the place itself. As the evening begins to return once more, the light softens across the desert. Shadows grow longer. The air cools again. And the tombs return to their deeper stillness. The entrances grow quiet. The footsteps fade. The voices disappear. And inside, everything remains. The walls. The objects. The words. Calm. Steady. Unchanged. And as the night settles gently over the land, the language of protection continues to rest within the stone, exactly as it has for countless years, quietly present, quietly enduring, and always, softly waiting. Night settles over the desert once more, soft and unhurried. The last traces of light fade from the sky, leaving behind a quiet darkness filled with distant stars. The air cools gently, and the land seems to rest. In this stillness, the valley becomes even quieter than before. The cliffs hold their shapes in shadow. The paths disappear into darkness. And beneath the surface, the chambers remain as they always have, unchanged, unmoving, wrapped in a silence that feels complete. It is during these quiet hours that the stories take on a slightly different tone. Not louder. Not sharper. But deeper. More reflective. There are those who have spent time near the tombs at night, who have remained close to the entrances as the darkness settles in. They do not speak of sudden events or clear visions. Instead, they describe a feeling. A quiet awareness. As though the stillness itself carries a presence. Not something seen. Not something heard. But something gently noticed. They speak of the idea of watchers. Not as figures standing in the dark, but as a sense that the space is not entirely empty. That the tombs, with their carefully placed objects and their softly carved words, continue to hold something beyond what can be touched. This idea is not new. It can be traced back to the inscriptions themselves. Many of the texts speak of guardians, beings or forces that remain with the resting place, ensuring that it stays as it was meant to be. These guardians are not described in ways that create fear. They are not loud or violent. They are calm, steady, unchanging, like the tomb itself. In one chamber, far beneath the surface, a series of symbols forms a quiet pattern along the wall. When studied closely, they describe a kind of watching that is constant but gentle. It is not a watch meant to control. It is a watch meant to maintain balance. To observe without interfering, unless something disturbs the order of the space. Another inscription, placed near a corner where the light rarely reaches, suggests that these watchers do not belong to a single moment in time. They exist across time. Present in the past, in the present, and in what has yet to come. This idea is difficult to hold fully. But it remains there, quietly carved into stone. Those who read these words often pause. Not because they are afraid, but because the meaning feels larger than simple understanding. It invites stillness. It invites reflection. Some who have spent long periods near these tombs begin to notice small changes in their own awareness. Not sudden shifts. Not dramatic experiences. But subtle differences. A heightened sense of quiet. A deeper attention to small sounds, the movement of air, the soft settling of sand, the distant echo of a step. They find themselves moving more slowly. Speaking less. Listening more. It is as though the space itself encourages this change, not through force, but through its steady presence. Others remain unchanged. They walk through the chambers, observe the walls, and leave with the same thoughts they carried in. For them, the tombs are places of history, of careful construction, of artistic and cultural meaning. They respect the space, but they do not feel anything beyond what they can see. Both experiences exist together. Neither one cancels the other. The tombs do not change based on who enters. They remain as they are. Still. Silent. Complete. The idea of watchers, like the idea of curses, becomes something that lives within the space without needing to be proven. It is part of the atmosphere. Part of the quiet story that surrounds the tombs. At night, this feeling seems to settle more deeply. Perhaps because the world above grows quieter. Perhaps because the darkness removes distraction. Or perhaps because the stillness becomes more noticeable when everything else fades. The entrances to the tombs stand open in the night, but the deeper chambers remain hidden in darkness. No light reaches them now. No movement disturbs their air. They exist exactly as they were left. And within them, the words remain. The symbols. The quiet messages of protection and balance. And the gentle suggestion that something continues to watch. Not with eyes. Not with intention in the way we understand it. But with a steady presence that does not fade. As the hours pass, the night deepens. The stars shift slowly across the sky. The air grows cooler still. and the desert rests in a calm that feels almost endless. Eventually, the first light of morning will return. The shadows will soften. The warmth will rise again. But for now, in this quiet moment, everything remains still. The valley. The tombs. The unseen watchers. All existing together in a silence that does not need to be explained. And within that silence, the story continues, not through sound or movement, but through presence alone, soft, steady, and always there. Morning returns again, as it always does. Not suddenly, not loudly, but slowly, as if the world prefers to wake without disturbance. The desert shifts from deep shadow into soft light. The sand begins to glow faintly. The cliffs of the valley reveal their shapes once more. Everything feels familiar. Everything feels unchanged. And yet, the story continues to move forward, not through action, but through memory and meaning. The tombs remain open in some places, sealed in others. They sit beneath the surface of the world like quiet thoughts that never fully fade. Some are visited often. Some are only remembered. Some remain untouched, resting in silence that stretches far beyond human time. And within all of them, the same idea persists. The idea that certain places are not simply spaces. They are states of balance. Carefully maintained. Carefully held. The inscriptions inside these tombs continue to speak in their gentle and steady language. They do not change with time. They do not adapt to new understanding. They remain exactly as they were written. One message, found in a deeper chamber, speaks in a calm and measured tone about consequence. It does not describe punishment. It does not describe anger. It describes outcome. It suggests that when order is disturbed, something within the natural flow of life shifts in response. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But gradually. Like water changing its course through sand. Like wind reshaping the edges of stone. This idea is repeated in different forms across many burial spaces. Always the same rhythm. Always the same quiet structure. Balance. Disruption. Return. Not as a threat, but as a reflection of how the world was understood. Those who lived in ancient Egypt did not separate the physical from the spiritual in the way later cultures often do. To them, everything was connected. The name of a person, the objects they owned, the space they were buried in, the words written beside them, all of it formed a single continuous existence. To disturb one part of that existence was to affect the whole. This understanding shaped the way the tombs were built. It shaped the way the words were written. And it shaped the calm warnings that later generations would come to call curses. In truth, these messages were part of protection. A way of preserving continuity. A way of ensuring that what was placed in the earth would remain undisturbed, not out of fear, but out of respect for order. But over time, as centuries passed and memory faded, the tone of these messages began to feel different to those who rediscovered them. The language of balance began to sound like warning. The language of consequence began to sound like threat. And so the idea of the curse slowly formed around them. Not all at once, but gradually. Like dust gathering in a still room. Some who studied these places focused on this shift in interpretation. They saw how meaning changes with time. How a message written for protection can later be understood as something more mysterious. Others preferred to remain close to the original feeling of the inscriptions. They read them as gentle reminders of respect. As expressions of belief in continuity and order. Both perspectives remained. Neither erased the other. Inside the tombs, nothing changed. The walls did not respond to interpretation. The objects did not move. The air remained still. And the words continued to rest in their original form. Calm. Measured. Present. There are accounts from those who have spent long hours within these spaces, observing, documenting, or simply standing in quiet reflection. They describe a gradual awareness that builds over time. Not something sudden. Not something alarming. But something subtle. A slowing of thought. A deepening of silence. A sense that the outside world feels farther away than it did before entering. Some interpret this as psychological response. The natural effect of enclosed, quiet spaces. Others describe it in more symbolic terms. As though the tombs encourage a state of stillness that aligns with their original purpose. Again, both interpretations exist side by side. And neither changes the tomb itself. As the day continues, the sun moves across the sky. Light and shadow shift gently over the valley. The wind passes through the stone corridors above ground, carrying only dust and silence. Below, the chambers remain unchanged. Holding their objects. Holding their words. Holding their meaning. And holding, in the quietest sense, the idea that some things are meant to remain as they are. As evening returns once more, the valley grows soft with shadow. The sky fades into deeper tones of blue and gray. The desert cools. And the world becomes still again. This is where the story rests for now, not in conclusion, but in continuation. Part 10 does not end the idea of curses. It only shows how they were never truly separate from the way the world was understood. Not as sudden forces, but as quiet consequences of balance. And in that understanding, the tombs remain what they have always been. Still places. Silent places. Places where words endure. And where meaning continues to exist, gently, beyond the reach of time. Night falls again, gently, without resistance. The desert does not change quickly. It never has. The same horizon, the same distant cliffs, the same slow breath of wind moving across the sand. Everything feels familiar, as if it has always been this way and will continue without interruption. And beneath this calm surface, the story continues to unfold. Not in action, but in memory. In presence. In the quiet persistence of things that do not disappear easily. The tombs remain scattered through the valley and beyond it, each one shaped by hands long gone. Some are deep within stone, hidden and protected. Others are closer to the surface, revealed by time and movement of the earth. Each one holds the same still qualities. Silence. Order. Care. And words. Always the words. They do not fade the way other things fade. Paint may soften. Stone may erode slightly. But meaning often remains longer than material. This is what makes these places feel different to those who enter them. Not because they are alive in any visible way, but because they are complete. Frozen in a moment that does not continue forward. Inside one of the older chambers, a narrow passage leads to a room that feels slightly deeper in stillness than the others. The air there is cooler, as if the earth itself holds the temperature steady. The walls are covered with faint inscriptions. Some are nearly worn away, but still visible if looked at closely. They describe protection, not as a force that acts, but as a condition that exists when balance is maintained. They suggest that the resting place is secure as long as it is not disturbed. And if it is disturbed, then the balance shifts not in punishment, but in consequence. A slow unfolding. A natural response. This idea appears again and again in different forms across the valley. It is not limited to a single tomb or a single ruler. It is part of a broader understanding of how the world was believed to function. A system where actions and outcomes were deeply connected, even when separated by time. Those who come to study these places often notice something subtle after spending long hours inside. The silence begins to feel different. At first, it is simply absence of sound. But over time, it becomes something more layered. A presence of stillness that feels almost structured. Not empty, but full in a quiet way. Some describe it as peaceful. Others describe it as heavy. Both descriptions come from the same environment. Neither is incorrect. It depends only on the person experiencing it. Outside the tombs, life continues in its usual rhythm. People move through their days, unaware of the details buried beneath the ground in distant places. But for those who have entered the deeper chambers, something often remains with them afterward. Not a clear thought. Not a defined emotion. But an impression. A lingering sense that they have stepped into a place where time behaves differently. This impression does not fade quickly. It can remain for hours, sometimes longer. Not as something disruptive, but as something quiet and reflective. As if part of the stillness has followed them back into the moving world. This is how the idea of the curse continues to exist in later understanding. Not as a single event. Not as a dramatic force. But as a feeling associated with crossing into spaces that were not meant to be changed. Spaces that were designed with intention. Spaces that were meant to remain in balance with themselves. The inscriptions never directly speak of fear. They speak of order. Of respect. Of continuity. And yet, over time, interpretation shifts. What was once understood as preservation becomes associated with consequence. What was once a gentle reminder becomes a warning in later retellings. And so the idea of curses grows around the original meaning like a shadow formed by changing light. The sand above the tombs continues its quiet work. It shifts slightly with each passing wind. Covering, uncovering, revealing, hiding. It does not remember in the human sense. But it preserves in its own way. Layer upon layer of time, resting over what came before. And beneath it all, the chambers remain unchanged. The same still air. The same careful arrangement. The same words carved into stone, holding their place without urgency. As the night deepens once more, the valley becomes almost completely silent. The cliffs lose their shape in darkness. The ground becomes a soft, undefined surface. And the tombs settle into their deeper quiet. Not active. Not asleep. Just present. Holding what they have always held. And continuing, without interruption, into whatever time comes next. This is part 11. Not an ending. Not a turning point. Just another slow step in a story that moves like the desert itself, quiet, steady, and always unfolding. The desert has a way of making everything feel distant. Even sounds that should carry far seem to dissolve before they travel too long. Even thoughts feel slower here, as if the air itself asks for patience. Night rests over the land again, soft and complete. The stars remain steady above, unchanged by time or movement below. The wind moves lightly, brushing across stone and sand in a way that feels almost careful. And beneath all of this, the tombs remain. Still. Silent. Holding their long, unbroken calm. By now, the idea of these places has grown in many directions. It is no longer just about what was found inside them. It is no longer just about inscriptions or objects or chambers carved deep into stone. It has become something larger. A way of thinking about presence. About consequence. About the way human intention can remain in a place long after the hands that created it are gone. Inside one of the deeper burial spaces, the air is especially still. There is a sense that even time moves more slowly here. The walls are close but not oppressive. They are shaped with care, forming a space that feels complete in its design. Every surface has meaning. Every corner holds purpose. The inscriptions continue their quiet presence along the stone. They speak again of protection. Not as something active in motion, but as something embedded into the structure of the space itself. A condition rather than an action. A state rather than a force. The idea is repeated in different forms throughout the chamber. That the resting place is stable when left undisturbed. That order remains when respect is maintained. That balance is not enforced, but naturally held. To modern understanding, these words often feel symbolic. To the ancient world that created them, they were simply how the world worked. Not metaphor. Not poetry. But structure. And within that structure, everything had its place. The tomb was not separate from life. It was a continuation of it. A different phase of existence, carefully prepared for. This is why the objects inside were arranged with such attention. Not for decoration, but for continuity. Each item had meaning. Each placement had intention. Nothing was random. Nothing was casual. Even the words carved into the walls were part of this continuity. They were not written as threats. They were written as instructions for the maintenance of balance. Over time, however, the meaning begins to shift in the minds of those who rediscover these places. Not because the words change, but because the context around them does. Centuries pass. Languages evolve. Beliefs shift. And what once felt natural becomes mysterious. What once felt structured becomes uncertain. In that uncertainty, imagination begins to fill the gaps. And from that space, the idea of curses grows. Not as a single invention, but as a slow layering of interpretation. Stories begin to gather around the tombs. Stories of misfortune following disturbance. Stories of illness, or change, or unexpected events occurring after exposure to the sealed spaces. These stories are not always connected in clear ways. They are often separate, scattered, incomplete. But they share a tone. A quiet suggestion that something lingers beyond the physical space. At the same time, there are those who see only the historical reality. They recognize the tombs as ancient constructions, deeply tied to belief systems centered on order and preservation. For them, the inscriptions are cultural expressions. They reflect worldview, not supernatural force. And yet, even among these perspectives, there is often a shared acknowledgement that these spaces carry a feeling unlike others. A stillness that is difficult to describe without using language that leans toward mystery. This is where the two understandings meet. Not in conflict, but in coexistence. The tombs themselves do not choose between interpretations. They remain unchanged. Their silence does not shift based on belief. Their stillness does not respond to meaning assigned from outside. They simply exist. As they have always existed. Within one chamber, there is a line of text placed low along the wall, near where light fades most easily. It speaks gently of remembrance. It suggests that as long as the name of the resting one is spoken, they remain connected to the world in some form. Not as presence in the living sense, but as continuation. A kind of enduring identity that does not fully disappear. This idea is not framed as fear. It is framed as care. A way of ensuring that nothing is lost. Even as time moves forward. Even as the world changes above. Outside, the desert continues its quiet transformation. Sand shifts slightly with the wind. Shadows stretch and shorten as hours pass. Nothing is fixed. Everything moves, slowly. But beneath the surface, the tombs remain fixed in their own way. Not resisting time, but existing outside its immediate flow. And in that difference, the feeling of separation becomes stronger. The sense that these places belong to a quieter layer of existence. As the night deepens in part 12, the valley grows almost entirely still. Even the wind becomes less noticeable. The world above softens into silence. And below, the chambers hold their final state of calm. The walls. The objects. The inscriptions. All resting together in a quiet balance that does not ask to be understood. Only acknowledged. Only observed. And as the desert continues into another long night, the story also continues not as conclusion, but as ongoing presence, slowly unfolding within silence itself. The desert night feels longer than most places. Not because time changes, but because everything in it moves with such softness that it becomes difficult to measure. There are no sharp sounds to divide the hours. No sudden changes to mark the passing of moments. Only silence. Only still air. Only the steady presence of stone and sand under a wide, dark sky. In this quiet, the tombs remain exactly as they have been. Some are open to the air. Some are sealed away beneath layers of earth. Some are known only through fragments of discovery and memory. But all of them share the same quality. A sense of permanence that does not feel heavy, but calm. As if they were designed not to resist time, but to exist alongside it in a different way. The idea of curses, which has followed these places through generations of interpretation, continues to move quietly through human understanding. It does not belong to any single moment. It does not begin or end in a clear place. It grows slowly, through retelling. Through reflection. Through the simple act of wondering what ancient words might mean when placed in unfamiliar contexts. Inside the tombs, the inscriptions remain unchanged. They do not adapt. They do not respond. They simply exist in their original form, carved and painted with the same intention they held when first created. Protection. Order. Continuity. These ideas form the core of every message. Even when the language seems to shift toward warning, it still rests on the same foundation. A belief that the world is structured, and that this structure must remain intact for balance to continue. In one chamber, deeper than many others, a passage leads into a space where the air feels slightly cooler. The stone here is smooth from time, but not worn away. The walls are covered with faint writing that seems to flow rather than stand rigidly. The text speaks of passage. Not only of movement through physical space, but of transition between states of existence. Life. Death. Memory. Continuation. It describes these not as separate conditions, but as parts of a single ongoing cycle. Within this cycle, the tomb holds its place as a point of rest. A place where movement slows, but does not end. A place where identity is preserved, not erased. And within this understanding, the inscriptions that later generations interpret as curses take on a different tone. They are not threats directed outward. They are statements about the importance of maintaining the structure that allows this continuity to remain undisturbed. Still, As time passes, interpretation changes. The world outside these tombs no longer thinks in the same language as the world that created them. So the meaning shifts. Not in the stone itself, but in the minds of those who encounter it later. Stories begin to form around these spaces. Not always connected, not always consistent, but carrying a shared sense of quiet consequence. A feeling that entering these places carries weight. That disturbing them has effects that may not be immediately visible. These ideas are passed from person to person. Sometimes as caution. Sometimes as reflection. Sometimes simply as memory. Over time, they become part of the identity of the tombs themselves. Not as official meaning, but as cultural presence. Yet inside the chambers, nothing changes. The objects remain where they were placed. The walls continue to hold their inscriptions. The air remains still, undisturbed by the movement of the world above. And in this contrast between interpretation and reality, the story continues to exist in two forms at once. One rooted in belief. One rooted in structure. Neither replacing the other. Both existing side by side. Some who spend time in these spaces describe a gradual shift in awareness. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive suddenly. It builds slowly, as the stillness becomes more noticeable. Thoughts begin to move differently. Attention settles on details that might otherwise be overlooked. The texture of stone. The arrangement of light. The quietness between sounds. Whether this is psychological or environmental, it does not change the experience itself. The tombs remain consistent in their effect. Still. Focused. Unchanging. Outside, the desert continues its slow rhythm. Wind moves across open spaces. Sand shifts in gentle patterns. The landscape does not hold memory in the way people do, but it preserves traces of what has passed through it. And beneath this shifting surface, the tombs remain anchored in their own kind of stillness. As night deepens again in part 13, the valley becomes almost entirely indistinguishable from shadow. The world above fades into quiet. And below, the chambers continue their long, uninterrupted presence. Holding words that do not age. Holding objects that do not move. Holding meanings that continue to exist, regardless of how they are understood. The idea of curses, in this context, does not stand as a single force. It becomes something softer. A reflection of how meaning changes over time. A reminder that interpretation itself can shape perception. And as the night continues, everything remains as it has always been. Quiet. Steady. Present. And still unfolding. Dawn arrives without urgency. The darkness does not vanish all at once. It loosens slowly, like something softening its grip. The stars fade one by one, and the sky begins to shift into pale layers of gray and gold. The desert does not wake. It simply changes its tone. From deep silence to lighter silence. From darkness to gentle light. And in this soft transition, the tombs remain unchanged. They do not react to morning or night. They do not respond to warmth or cold. They exist in a state that feels slightly separate from the rhythm of the world above. Inside their chambers, nothing has moved. The inscriptions are still in place. The objects remain arranged with the same care. The air is still, carrying the same calm that has been present for centuries. As light reaches the entrances of the tombs, it begins to reveal what was hidden in shadow. Stone surfaces become visible again. Faint carvings reappear along the walls. The quiet colors of painted scenes return to view. Figures walking, offering, resting. Scenes of daily life and eternal continuation. Everything is still. Everything is complete. There is no sense of interruption within these spaces. Only preservation. And yet, as the world outside continues its movement, the perception of these places continues to evolve. The idea of curses, as it has grown through time, now exists more as a layer of interpretation than as a fixed belief. It is shaped by distance. Distance in time. Distance in understanding. Distance between the world that created the tombs and the world that later rediscovered them. In the original context, the words were not isolated warnings. They were part of a larger system of meaning. A system in which names, objects, spaces, and written language were all connected. To maintain one part of that system was to maintain the whole. So the inscriptions that later appear as curses were, in their own time, expressions of care. Care for continuity. Care for order. Care for the unseen journey of the one who rested within. But as centuries passed, that system was no longer fully visible. Only fragments remained. And fragments can feel different when separated from their original structure. A line of text that once belonged to a complete idea can begin to feel like a standalone warning. A symbol that once represented balance can begin to suggest mystery. A phrase that once described order can begin to sound like consequence. In this way, meaning shifts. Not because the words change, but because the world around them does. Inside the tombs, however, the original intention remains unchanged. The spaces continue to reflect their purpose. To preserve. To hold. To maintain continuity between life and what was believed to come after. There is a quiet consistency in every chamber. A rhythm that does not break. Even when visitors come and go. Even when light changes across the walls. Even when centuries pass above them. Some who spend time in these spaces begin to notice the contrast more clearly. The world outside feels fluid, constantly shifting. But inside, everything feels anchored. Not frozen in a harsh sense, but held. As if the tombs exist in a slower current of time, one that does not rush forward but continues at its own steady pace. This perception contributes to the feeling that surrounds these places. The sense that they are separate from ordinary space. Not because they are alive in any literal sense, but because they hold a different relationship to time and stillness. And within that stillness, the idea of curses becomes less about fear and more about consequence understood through structure. If balance is maintained, the space remains unchanged. If balance is disturbed, then change naturally follows. Not as punishment, but as continuation of cause and effect. This is how the ancient worldview shaped these inscriptions. And this is how they were meant to be understood within their own time. As the morning grows brighter in part 14, the desert becomes warm again. Light spreads evenly across the land. Shadows shorten and soften. The valley opens fully to the day. And beneath it all, the tombs continue their quiet existence. Unmoved by interpretation. Unchanged by time. Holding their inscriptions, their objects, and their stillness exactly as they were meant to be held. The story does not conclude here. It simply continues forward with the same gentle rhythm it has always followed. Quiet. Measured. And still unfolding beneath the slow passage of time. The desert in daylight feels almost forgiving. The heat is present, steady, but not violent. It settles over the land like a familiar blanket. The sand reflects light in soft waves. The cliffs cast short, defined shadows that slowly shift as the sun moves. Everything above ground appears simple, open, clear. But beneath that simplicity, the valley holds its deeper layers. The tombs remain where they have always been. Some exposed, some partially hidden, some still waiting beneath untouched earth. And each one continues its quiet existence without change. Inside these spaces, the inscriptions still speak in their original language of intention. They do not evolve. They do not adjust to new meanings. They remain fixed in the moment they were created. Yet the way they are understood continues to shift across time. This is where the idea of curses becomes more complex. Not as something written directly into the stone in the way later stories often suggest, but as something formed between text and interpretation, between intention and perception, between ancient worldview and modern reading. The inscriptions often use language centered on protection, on maintaining order, on ensuring that what was placed within the tomb remains undisturbed, so that the intended journey of the deceased can continue without interruption. In their original context, this is not unusual. It is expected. It is part of how reality was understood. But when these words are separated from their cultural foundation, they begin to take on a different tone. A tone shaped by distance, by unfamiliarity, by the absence of shared belief systems. A phrase that once described balance can begin to sound like consequence. A statement about order can begin to resemble warning. And slowly, over time, the idea of a curse forms around these meanings like a quiet echo. Inside one burial chamber, there is a sequence of inscriptions arranged in a careful progression along the wall. They describe protection in layered forms. Not as a single force, but as multiple conditions working together. Respect for the space, preservation of names, maintenance of offerings, continuity of remembrance. Each part supports the others. Each part contributes to stability. And when viewed as a whole, the message becomes less about fear and more about structure. A system designed to preserve harmony between the physical and spiritual aspects of existence. But later interpretation often isolates certain phrases. It removes them from the full structure. And in isolation, meaning can shift. What was once part of a balanced system becomes a fragment that feels more mysterious than it originally was. This is not a distortion in a negative sense. It is a natural result of time and cultural distance. Human understanding changes as language and context change. And ancient systems of belief, when viewed from outside their original framework, often appear more enigmatic than they once were. Within the tombs themselves, nothing reflects this shift. The stone does not respond to interpretation. The objects remain in place. The air remains still. The space continues to hold its original purpose without alteration. Some visitors to these places describe a gradual awareness that builds as they remain inside longer. At first, everything appears purely physical. Stone, color, shape, structure. But over time, the repetition of stillness begins to form a different impression. A sense of continuity that feels deeper than surface observation. Not supernatural in a sudden way, but steady, persistent. Like the environment itself is encouraging a slower mode of attention. Others do not experience this at all. They see only architecture, history, and cultural expression. They study the inscriptions as text, not atmosphere. They analyze structure, not feeling. Both perspectives exist within the same space. Neither is removed from reality. Neither defines the tomb entirely. The tomb simply remains what it is. A preserved environment shaped by belief, intention, and time. Outside, the desert continues its slow transformation under the sun. Wind traces soft paths across the surface. Sand shifts in small, continuous adjustments. Nothing stays exactly as it was. Everything changes gradually. Except beneath the surface, where the tombs maintain their own kind of permanence. As part 15 continues toward its quiet close, the contrast becomes more noticeable. Above ground, movement defines the world. Below ground, stillness defines it. And between those two states, interpretation continues to evolve. The idea of curses remains, not as a fixed truth, but as a lens through which later generations attempt to understand ancient expressions of order and protection. Not something separate from the tombs, but something formed around them. Like language shaped by distance. Like meaning shaped by time. And as the desert settles once again into evening, everything returns to calm. Light fades. Shadows lengthen. The valley grows quiet. And the tombs remain exactly as they have always been, still, steady, and present within the long, slow unfolding of history. Evening comes in a slow, quiet way over the desert. The sky softens from gold into pale blue, then into deeper tones of dusk. The heat of the day fades gently, leaving behind a coolness that settles into the sand and stone. The valley becomes quieter than before, as if the world itself is lowering its voice. Nothing feels rushed here. Nothing needs to be. And beneath this calm surface, the tombs continue their steady, unchanged existence. By this point in the long unfolding of their story, many of these ancient spaces have been known for a long time. Some have been entered, studied, and carefully documented. Others have been left partially untouched, their deeper chambers still resting in darkness. But even after discovery, something important remains the same. The tombs do not change because they are found. They do not lose their stillness because they are seen. They remain what they were always designed to be. Spaces of continuation. Spaces of preservation. Spaces where time does not behave in the same way as it does outside. Inside these chambers, the inscriptions still hold their quiet presence. The words carved into stone do not soften in meaning, even if their surfaces slowly age. They remain structured, deliberate, and precise. They speak of order. They speak of continuity. They speak of respect for the space and for what it contains. In their original setting, these ideas formed a complete system of understanding. Life was not viewed as something that ended abruptly. It was seen as something that transitioned. Something that moved into another form. The tomb was not a final resting point in the modern sense. It was a continuation of existence in a different state. Everything placed inside the tomb served this idea. Objects. Images. Names. Words. All were part of maintaining identity beyond physical life. Within this framework, the inscriptions that later become associated with curses were not isolated warnings. They were part of a broader structure of preservation. They ensured that the system remained intact. That the balance between worlds was maintained. That nothing essential was disrupted. But over time, as language changes and cultures shift, the original structure becomes less visible. What remains are fragments. Individual lines. Partial ideas. Separated from the full system that once gave them context. And when fragments are viewed alone, they often take on new meanings. A phrase about maintaining order may begin to feel like a warning about disturbance. A statement about protection may appear as a statement of consequence. This shift does not happen suddenly. It happens gradually, across generations of interpretation. As knowledge moves from one cultural framework into another, meaning adapts. Not because the original intent disappears, but because the surrounding understanding changes. Inside the tombs, however, nothing reflects this transformation. The stone does not reinterpret itself. The objects do not rearrange their meaning. The space remains consistent with its origin. This creates a quiet tension between what is and what is understood, between structure and interpretation, between original intention and later meaning. Some who enter these spaces focus on the physical reality. They see architecture, craftsmanship, and cultural expression. They document inscriptions as historical records. They study design and symbolism. For them, the tombs are a window into a belief system that shaped an entire civilization. Others, standing in the same spaces, feel something less defined. Not fear, not certainty, but awareness of atmosphere. A sense that stillness itself becomes more noticeable the longer one remains inside. Neither response cancels the other. Both exist at the same time. Both are valid ways of experiencing the same environment. And the tombs remain unchanged by either perspective. As night approaches more fully in part 16, the desert becomes almost entirely quiet. The last traces of light disappear from the horizon. Stars begin to reappear above the valley. The air grows cooler, and the landscape settles into shadow. Beneath the surface, the chambers remain in their long-held stillness. No movement. No shift. Only presence. The inscriptions continue to rest where they were placed. The objects remain as they were arranged. The meaning, both original and interpreted, continues to exist in parallel layers. And the idea of curses, now distant from its earliest form, remains part of the story not as a single force, but as a long echo of interpretation moving through time. As the valley enters full night once again, everything becomes quiet. Not empty. Not active. Simply still. And in that stillness, the story continues forward, slowly, without interruption, as it always has beneath the enduring calm of ancient stone and desert air. Night settles again over the desert, soft and familiar. The stars appear one by one, scattered across the sky like quiet points of memory. The air is cool now, resting gently on the land. The cliffs of the valley become darker shapes against the night, and the sand loses its brightness, turning into a smooth, silent surface. Everything feels distant. Everything feels still. And beneath this stillness, the ancient spaces remain unchanged. By now, many of these tombs exist in a world that is no longer ancient itself. They are part of study, part of history, part of careful preservation. People come from far away to observe them, to document them, to understand them. And each visitor brings their own perspective with them, shaped by time, culture, and expectation. Inside the tombs, however, nothing reflects this shift. The stone does not recognize modern eyes. The inscriptions do not adjust their meaning. They remain exactly as they were carved, in the same order, with the same intention. What changes is not the tomb. It is the way it is seen. This is where the idea of curses becomes even more layered. In earlier times, the inscriptions were part of a living belief system. They were practical expressions of how the world was understood. But in the modern world, they often exist outside that system. They are read without the full cultural framework that once gave them clarity. And so interpretation begins to stretch. To search for meaning beyond what is immediately visible. Some readers focus on the protective nature of the texts. They see them as expressions of care for the dead. As part of a spiritual system that valued continuity and respect. Others focus on the tone of consequence within certain lines. They read references to disturbance and imbalance and interpret them through a more modern lens of warning or superstition. Neither approach is entirely complete on its own. Both capture parts of the original intent. But neither fully reconstructs the full worldview in which these inscriptions were first created. Inside one chamber, the walls carry a long sequence of writing that moves in a slow, deliberate pattern. It begins with descriptions of protection. It continues with references to preservation. And it ends with a reminder of order. Not order enforced through fear, but order maintained through balance. The structure of the message is important. It is not random. It is carefully arranged to reflect a complete system of thought. Life, death, identity, memory, and continuity are all connected within it. When read as a whole, the inscriptions feel less like isolated warnings and more like a philosophy embedded in stone. But time changes how philosophy is seen. What once was familiar becomes distant. What once was clear becomes open to interpretation. And within that distance, new narratives begin to form. Stories of unexplained events. Stories of coincidence. Stories of unease following contact with ancient spaces. These stories are not always connected. They are not always consistent. But they share a common emotional tone. A sense that the past carries weight into the present. A sense that entering such spaces is not a neutral experience. At the same time, many who study these sites continue to emphasize their historical and cultural importance. They see the inscriptions as valuable records of belief systems that shaped one of the world's earliest complex civilizations. They focus on architecture, language, ritual practice, and artistic expression. For them, the tombs are not mysterious in a supernatural sense. They are deeply meaningful in a historical one. And yet, even among careful study and scientific observation, there is often an acknowledgement of atmosphere. The quiet that exists within these spaces is difficult to ignore. Not because it suggests anything beyond the physical world, but because it is unusually consistent, unbroken, present in a way that feels distinct from ordinary environments. This quietness becomes part of the experience itself. Not as meaning, but as context. Outside the tombs, the desert continues its slow and steady rhythm. Wind moves lightly across the sand. Time passes without resistance. Nothing remains fixed except the ancient stone beneath the surface. As part 17 moves toward its close, the contrast between interpretation and reality becomes more subtle. The tombs do not change. The inscriptions do not change. But the meanings attached to them continue to shift with each generation that encounters them. And in that shifting, the idea of curses persists not as a single defined truth, but as a reflection of how human understanding evolves when faced with the unknown. As the night deepens further, the valley rests in complete stillness once again. No movement. No sound. Only the quiet presence of stone, sand, and memory. And beneath it all, the story continues slow, uninterrupted, and gently unfolding into whatever comes next. The desert night feels heavier now, not in weight, but in depth. It is the kind of silence that does not feel empty. It feels layered, as if each moment rests gently on the one before it, building something quiet and continuous across time. The stars remain still above the valley. The cliffs remain dark and unmoving. And the sand holds its shape in soft, pale curves that shift only slightly with the wind. Nothing in the landscape breaks the calm. And beneath this calm, the ancient tombs continue their long, uninterrupted stillness. At this stage in their history, many of these spaces are no longer hidden. They are known, recorded, and preserved in various ways. Some are carefully protected from the elements. Some are studied with great attention. Some remain partially sealed, their deeper sections untouched for long periods of time. Yet despite all of this human presence, something essential does not change. The tombs do not become louder. They do not become more active. They do not respond to the passage of time in any visible way. They remain exactly as they were designed to remain. Still. Contained. Complete within themselves. Inside, the inscriptions continue their quiet function. They are not dynamic texts. They do not shift in meaning or structure. They are fixed expressions of belief, carefully carved into stone so that they might endure beyond the fragile span of human life. Their language is calm and structured. It moves through ideas of protection, preservation, and continuity with steady intention. At its core, it reflects a worldview in which life does not end abruptly but transitions into another state of being. A state that requires care. A state that requires balance. A state that depends on the maintenance of order between visible and invisible aspects of existence. In this system, the tomb is not a place of absence. It is a place of continuation. Everything placed within it serves that continuity. Objects are not random. Words are not decorative. Even silence is part of the structure. When later generations encounter these inscriptions, they do so from outside this original framework. They bring with them different assumptions about life, death, and meaning. And so the text is no longer read as part of a complete system. It is read as fragments of a system that must be reconstructed. This is where interpretation begins to diverge. Some readers see the inscriptions as purely symbolic. They interpret them as cultural expressions of respect and order, shaped by ancient belief systems that differ from modern perspectives. Others, encountering the more formal or absolute tone of certain phrases, perceive them as warnings that extend beyond symbolism. Not necessarily in a literal sense, but in an emotional or atmospheric sense. A sense that certain spaces carry consequences for disturbance. This dual reading is not a contradiction. It is a result of distance. Distance in time. Distance in language. Distance in worldview. Inside one of the deeper chambers, the inscriptions follow a slow, deliberate sequence along the wall. They begin with affirmation of protection. They continue with descriptions of preservation. And they end with the idea of continuity maintained through respect. Each part supports the next. Each part depends on the others. When viewed as a whole, the message is stable and complete. But when separated into individual lines, the tone can shift slightly depending on how it is read. This is one of the reasons later interpretations sometimes lean toward the idea of curses. Not because the original intent was centered on harm or fear, but because isolated phrases can appear more absolute when removed from their original structure. Still, within the tombs themselves, nothing changes. The stone remains fixed. The carvings remain intact. The air remains still. The space continues to hold its original purpose without deviation. Outside, the desert remains in constant but subtle motion. Wind reshapes the surface slowly. Light and shadow alternate across the valley with quiet rhythm. Time moves forward, but gently, without disruption. Some who spend time within these tombs describe a gradual awareness that develops over extended periods of stillness. Not a dramatic shift. Not an overwhelming sensation. But a subtle change in attention. Details become more noticeable. Silence becomes more defined. The boundary between observer and environment feels slightly more present. Others experience nothing beyond normal observation. They document, measure, and record. They leave with a clear sense of history and structure. Both responses exist within the same space. Both are valid within their own frameworks. And neither alters the tomb itself. As Part 18 moves toward its quiet end, the valley begins to settle further into night. The sky darkens completely. The stars remain steady points of light above. The cliffs dissolve into shadow. And beneath the surface, the tombs continue their unbroken stillness. No movement. No change. Only continuity. The inscriptions remain as they were carved. The objects remain as they were placed. And the meaning, shaped differently across time, continues to exist in multiple layers at once. As interpretation, as history, and as memory. And in this layered silence, the story continues onward quietly, steadily, and without end. The desert night stretches on, steady and unbroken. There is a kind of stillness here that does not feel temporary. It feels continuous, as if the land does not distinguish between one hour and the next. The stars remain fixed in their slow patterns. The air holds its coolness without urgency. Even the wind, when it moves, does so gently, almost cautiously. Everything feels held in place. And beneath this quiet surface, the tombs continue their long existence, unchanged by time above them. By now, they have been known in many ways. As archaeological sites. As historical records. As cultural windows into an ancient world. And, in some retellings, as places associated with curses. Each of these perspectives exists simultaneously in the modern understanding of these spaces. None fully cancels the others. They overlap, like layers of interpretation placed over the same foundation. Inside the tombs, however, there is no layering of meaning. There is only structure. Stone shaped into chambers. Passages designed with intention. Walls inscribed with language meant to endure. The inscriptions themselves remain calm and deliberate. They do not shift in tone. They do not respond to how they are perceived. They continue to express the same ideas they held when first created. Protection. Continuity. Order. These are not isolated concepts. They form a connected system of belief. A system in which the physical and spiritual aspects of existence are not separate, but interwoven. Within this system, the tomb is not a place of ending. It is a place of transition. A carefully prepared environment where identity, memory, and existence continue in a different form. Everything within the tomb reflects this understanding. The placement of objects. The arrangement of space. The language carved into stone. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is without purpose. As later generations encounter these spaces, they do so without full access to this original framework. The worldview that shaped these structures is distant in time, language, and cultural practice. And so interpretation becomes necessary. Meaning must be reconstructed from fragments. This process of reconstruction is where variation begins. Some interpret the inscriptions through historical and cultural study. They focus on religious systems, burial practices, and symbolic language. They see the tombs as expressions of continuity and care, shaped by deeply structured belief systems. Others, reading certain phrases outside their original context, sense something more ambiguous. A tone of consequence. A suggestion that disturbing certain spaces may lead to imbalance. Not necessarily supernatural in a literal sense, but symbolic enough to inspire narrative. This is how the idea of curses continues to exist. Not as a fixed doctrine, but as a story that grows from interpretation layered over time. Inside one chamber, the walls carry a sequence of inscriptions arranged with careful symmetry. They move from one idea to the next in a steady progression. Protection is described first, then preservation, then continuity, and finally, the maintenance of order through respect for what has been placed within the space. When read as a complete system, the message is consistent and structured. But when separated into fragments, certain phrases can appear more absolute than they were intended to be in isolation. This is not a distortion in the physical sense. The text remains unchanged. The stone remains unchanged. What changes is only the lens through which it is viewed. And that lens is shaped by time. Language evolves. Belief systems evolve. Even the concept of death itself is understood differently across cultures and eras. All of this contributes to the shifting interpretation of ancient inscriptions. Yet within the tombs themselves, no shift occurs. The air remains still. The walls remain intact. The objects remain undisturbed. The space continues in its original state, unaffected by external understanding. Some who enter these chambers describe a noticeable slowing of perception. Not something supernatural, but something tied to environment. The absence of sound. The consistency of enclosure. The repetition of stillness. Over time, attention becomes more focused. Thoughts become quieter. Details become more present. Others describe nothing unusual at all. They experience the space as they would any carefully constructed historical site. Structured. Informative. Stable. Both experiences coexist without conflict. And neither alters the tomb. As part 19 reaches its end, the desert outside continues its slow and quiet transformation. Night remains deep. The valley remains still. And beneath it all, the tombs continue their uninterrupted existence. Holding their inscriptions. Holding their objects. Holding their meaning in a state that does not require interpretation to persist. And in that enduring stillness, the story continues forward without noise, without interruption, and without end. The desert remains quiet in the deepest hours of the night. Not silent in a way that feels empty, but silent in a way that feels complete. The kind of silence that settles into everything it touches. The sand, the stone, the open air, all of it resting under the same calm sky. Nothing in the valley moves in any noticeable way. And yet, time continues. Slowly. Without resistance. Beneath this steady night, the tombs remain as they have always been. Not changed by discovery. Not altered by attention. Not affected by interpretation. They exist in a condition that feels separate from the shifting world above, as though their state was established long ago and has simply continued without interruption. Inside, the inscriptions still line the walls with measured precision. Their language is structured, balanced, and deliberate. It does not wander. It does not change tone. It remains anchored in the worldview that created it. A worldview where existence is continuous rather than divided into strict endings and beginnings. Where identity persists beyond physical form. Where memory, name, and presence are not easily separated. Within this understanding, the tomb is not a place of closure. It is a place of continuation. Everything within it supports that idea. The arrangement of objects. The placement of images. The written language carved into stone. Each element is part of a unified system of meaning. A system designed to preserve balance across different states of existence. When later generations encounter these structures, they do so with different expectations. Their frameworks of understanding are shaped by other histories, other languages, other beliefs. And so the original system is no longer immediately visible. It must be interpreted, reconstructed, translated not only linguistically, but conceptually. This process naturally introduces variation. Some interpretations emphasize the cultural and religious structure of ancient Egypt. They see the inscriptions as part of a deeply organized belief system, focused on continuity, order, and the care of the dead. Others focus more on the tone of certain passages when isolated. They notice references to disturbance and imbalance and interpret them through a lens shaped by later ideas of warning or consequence. In this way, meaning expands beyond its original boundaries. Not through change in the text, but through change in perspective. This is where the modern idea of curses continues to exist. Not as a direct statement from the past, but as a layered interpretation built over time. A narrative formed where structure and translation intersect. Inside one chamber, the inscriptions form a continuous flow along the stone surface. They are arranged in a way that guides reading through a sequence of ideas. First, the establishment of protection. Then, the maintenance of order. Then, the continuation of identity beyond physical life. And finally, the importance of preserving the conditions that allow this continuity to remain stable. Each part depends on the others. Together, they form a complete conceptual framework. When viewed as a whole, the message is consistent and stable. But when separated into individual fragments, certain phrases may appear more absolute than they were originally intended to be when understood within the full system. This is a natural effect of distance. Not only physical distance, but temporal and cultural distance. The farther a system of thought moves from its origin, the more it is reshaped by the contexts that later surround it. Inside the tombs themselves, no such reshaping occurs. The stone does not interpret itself. The inscriptions do not shift meaning. The objects remain precisely where they were placed. And the air remains unchanged, held in a state of quiet continuity. Some who enter these spaces describe a gradual deepening of awareness over time spent inside. Not a sudden transformation, but a subtle shift in attention. The stillness becomes more noticeable. The absence of external sound becomes more defined. The structure of the space becomes more present in perception. Others experience nothing beyond observation and documentation. They study, record, and analyze. They move through the chambers with academic focus, seeing the tombs as historical constructions that reflect a complex and highly developed civilization. Both experiences exist within the same environment. Neither overrides the other. And neither alters the tomb itself. As Part 20 reaches its closing moments, the desert outside remains in deep night. The sky holds its pattern of distant stars. The valley rests in shadow. And beneath the surface, the tombs continue their uninterrupted state of stillness. Holding their inscriptions. Holding their structure. Holding their meaning exactly as it was created. And as time continues forward, slowly, and without urgency, the story also continues not as conclusion, but as ongoing presence, resting quietly within the long and steady silence of ancient stone. The night feels even quieter now. Not because anything has changed, but because the mind settles deeper into the rhythm of stillness the longer it stays with it. The desert does not introduce new sounds. It simply continues its familiar absence of noise, as if silence itself has become the natural language of the land. The sky above remains open and wide, filled with steady stars that do not rush across the darkness. the valley below remains unchanged. And beneath the surface of that valley, the tombs continue their long, uninterrupted presence. They do not age in the way living things age. They do not shift in the way landscapes slowly shift. They remain anchored in their original design, shaped by intention rather than time. Inside these chambers, the inscriptions still rest along the stone walls. Their arrangement is deliberate, almost rhythmic in its structure. Lines of text follow one another in a steady progression, not meant to be hurried through, but to be understood as a whole. They speak of protection. They speak of order. They speak of continuity. And they speak of the conditions required for that continuity to remain intact. In the world that created these tombs, nothing existed in isolation. A person's name was not just a sound. It was part of their existence. An object was not just material. It was part of their continuation. A written word was not just communication. It was an extension of meaning into permanence. Within this system, the tomb served as a carefully constructed space where all of these elements could remain connected. Where life could extend beyond its visible boundaries. Where identity could persist in a different form. The inscriptions were part of this structure. They were not separate commentary placed upon it. They were active components of it. In this sense, what later generations come to call curses were never isolated warnings. They were expressions of how stability was maintained. How continuity was protected. How disruption was understood within a system that valued balance above separation. But time does not preserve context in full. It preserves fragments. And fragments, when encountered alone, invite interpretation. This is where meaning begins to stretch across generations. Where original intent and later understanding begin to diverge gently, without conflict, but with distance. Some readers focus on the structural nature of the inscriptions. They see them as part of a larger theological and cultural system, deeply interconnected and consistent in its worldview. Others focus on specific phrases that speak of consequence when order is disturbed. These phrases, when isolated from their full context, can appear more absolute than they were originally intended to be. Not because the meaning has changed within the stone, but because the surrounding framework is no longer fully present. In this way, the idea of curses continues to exist as a layered interpretation. Not a singular truth, but a narrative that has grown over time through repeated reading, retelling, and reflection. Inside one chamber, the walls carry inscriptions that move in a continuous sequence. The writing does not break abruptly. It flows from one idea to the next with careful transitions. Protection leads into preservation. Preservation leads into continuity. Continuity leads into the maintenance of order. Each concept depends on the others. Together, they form a complete and stable understanding of how existence was believed to function. When this system is viewed in full, it is not centered on fear. It is centered on balance. But when viewed in parts, separated from the whole, certain expressions can take on a different emotional tone. This shift is not a distortion of the original message. It is a natural outcome of time, language, and cultural separation. The stone remains unchanged. The writing remains unchanged. What changes is the distance between interpretation and origin. Within the tombs themselves, there is no such distance. Everything remains in its intended place. The air is still. The objects are undisturbed. The inscriptions remain fixed in their original meaning. Some who spend time within these spaces describe a quiet deepening of attention. Not a dramatic or unusual experience, but a gradual awareness of stillness that becomes more pronounced the longer one remains inside. Sound feels softer. Movement feels slower. Perception becomes more focused on subtle details that might otherwise go unnoticed. Others experience the space in a more neutral way, observing only structure, design, and historical significance. Both responses are valid within the same environment. Neither defines the space completely, and neither alters its nature. As part 21 draws to its gentle close, the desert outside continues its steady rhythm under the night sky. No new movement appears. No sudden change occurs. Only the continuation of quiet presence. And beneath the surface, the tombs remain exactly as they were designed to remain. Holding their inscriptions. Holding their purpose. Holding their meaning in a state that does not fade, even as interpretation continues to evolve around them. And so the story continues, not as conclusion, but as ongoing stillness, deep, steady, and quietly unending beneath the ancient weight of time. The desert night feels almost timeless now. It does not move forward in any noticeable way. It simply exists, stretching gently in every direction, holding the valley in a calm and steady darkness. The air is cool, still, and patient. Even the wind seems to arrive only briefly, as if it does not wish to disturb the silence for too long. Above, the stars remain scattered across the sky, unchanged and distant. Below, the land rests in the same unbroken quiet. And beneath that land, the tombs continue their long, uninterrupted existence. They do not participate in the passing of time in the way the surface world does. They do not respond to seasons. They do not shift with weather or wind. They remain anchored in a carefully constructed stillness, shaped long ago by intention and belief. Inside these spaces, the inscriptions still line the stone walls in steady formation. Their arrangement follows patterns that feel almost ceremonial in structure, but deeply practical in purpose. They move through ideas of protection. They move through ideas of preservation. They move through ideas of continuity. And they return again and again to the importance of maintaining balance between what is visible and what is unseen. In the worldview that created these tombs, there was no strict separation between life and what comes after life. Instead, there was continuity. A flow of existence that did not end abruptly, but transformed. The tomb was part of that transformation. A carefully prepared environment where identity could remain intact beyond physical form. Every object placed within it was part of this understanding. Every inscription supported it. Every structural detail contributed to it. The words carved into stone were not isolated messages. They were extensions of this system of thought. When they speak of protection, they are describing a condition necessary for stability. When they speak of disturbance, they are describing an interruption in that condition. And when they speak of consequences, they are describing the natural outcome of imbalance within a structured worldview. There is no separation between these elements. They function together as one continuous idea. But time changes how such systems are perceived. As centuries pass, language evolves. Cultural context fades. Original frameworks become less visible to those encountering them later. What remains are fragments. Stone. Symbols. Partial inscriptions. And from these fragments, meaning must be reconstructed. This reconstruction is where interpretation begins to diverge. Some approaches focus on the internal logic of the system itself. They attempt to understand the inscriptions as part of a complete cultural and religious structure, where every phrase connects to a larger whole. Others encounter isolated lines and interpret them more independently, focusing on tone and phrasing without the full contextual structure that originally supported them. In this space between full system and fragment, the idea of curses takes shape. Not as a single, unified belief, but as a narrative formed through distance. A narrative that reflects how human understanding adapts when confronted with incomplete context. Inside one of the deeper chambers, the inscriptions are arranged in long, flowing sequences that follow the contours of the stone. They are not broken abruptly. They are continuous, almost rhythmic in their structure. Each line connects to the next, forming a progression of ideas that build upon one another. Protection is not described as an isolated force. It is described as something maintained through ongoing conditions. Continuity is not presented as static. It is presented as something sustained through balance. Order is not enforced externally. It is upheld internally within the system of belief. When viewed in full, the message is consistent and complete. But when viewed in parts, separated from their surrounding structure, individual phrases can appear more absolute than they were intended to be in isolation. This is not a change in meaning within the inscriptions themselves. It is a change in how they are encountered. Outside the tombs, the desert continues its slow and steady movement. Sand shifts slightly with each passing wind. Light and shadow trade places across the valley as the hours move forward. Nothing remains fixed on the surface. Everything is in subtle motion. Except beneath that surface, where the tombs remain unchanged. They do not respond to time. They do not respond to interpretation. They remain as they were designed to remain. Still. Contained. Complete. Some who spend time within these spaces describe a gradual shift in awareness. Not dramatic. Not sudden. But quiet and cumulative. The absence of external sound becomes more noticeable over time. The structure of the space becomes more present in perception. Thoughts begin to slow slightly, aligning with the environment's stillness. Others experience nothing beyond observation and documentation, seeing only architecture, history, and cultural expression. Both perspectives coexist without conflict. Neither defines the space entirely. As Part 22 reaches its gentle close, the valley settles once more into deeper night. The sky remains vast and unchanged. The desert remains still. And beneath it all, the tombs continue their quiet existence, holding their inscriptions, their objects, and their meaning in a state that does not diminish with time. And in that enduring stillness, the story continues slowly, steadily, and without end, resting in the quiet distance between worlds. The night over the desert does not feel like an ending. It feels like something that simply continues, even when nothing new is added to it. The sky remains wide and still, filled with distant light that does not hurry anywhere. The valley rests beneath it, unchanged in its shape, unchanged in its silence. Everything has settled. Everything has softened. And beneath all of it, the ancient tombs remain. Not as active places. Not as places of movement or change. But as places of preservation, holding their long history in quiet balance with time itself. Inside these chambers, the inscriptions are still there. Carved into stone that has outlasted countless generations above it. Their words remain fixed in the same careful structure they were given at the moment of creation. Protection. Continuity. Order. These ideas do not fade, because they were never meant to move in the first place. They were meant to remain. The so-called curses, so often spoken of in later stories, do not appear here as living forces or sudden punishments. They exist only as interpretations placed over something older and more structured. In their original form, these texts were not expressions of fear. They were expressions of care. Care for the resting place. Care for the name. care for the continuity of existence as it was understood in that world. But time has a way of changing how meaning is held. What was once part of a complete system becomes, in later centuries, a fragment seen through unfamiliar eyes. And from that distance, imagination begins to grow around what is not fully understood. Not as truth, not as falsehood, but as story. A story shaped by the quiet space between ancient intention and modern interpretation. Inside the tombs, however, there is no distance. No shift in meaning. No change in purpose. Only stillness. The stone remains where it was placed. The words remain where they were carved. The air remains unchanged, as if time itself moves more gently here, or perhaps not at all. Outside, the desert continues its endless rhythm. Wind passes. Sand shifts. Light returns and fades again in slow cycles that stretch far beyond human attention. And life above goes on, as it always has, carrying forward its own movement, its own changes, its own forgetting. But beneath it all, the tombs do not follow that rhythm. They hold a different kind of time. A quiet kind. A preserved kind. Not alive, and not absent, simply enduring in their intended stillness. The idea of curses, when it lingers in human memory, belongs more to that space between understanding and distance than to the stone itself. It is what happens when meaning travels far from its origin. When structure becomes fragment. When intention becomes interpretation. And when silence becomes filled with imagined voice. But the tombs themselves do not speak. They do not warn. They do not react. They remain as they were built to remain. Still. Complete. And quietly present beneath the passing centuries. As the final moments of this long night settle over the desert, nothing arrives to conclude the story in a sharp way. There is no final revelation waiting in the stone. No sudden change hidden in the dark. Only continuity. Only stillness. Only the gentle, enduring presence of what was once carefully made and carefully left behind. And as everything fades into a deeper quiet, even the idea of curses softens into something else entirely. Not fear. Not mystery. But memory. A memory carried forward by time, resting quietly in the long, open silence of ancient Egypt.